Hello again, dear listener. You've arrived at the perfect time for a story from the past, told gently and slowly as night wraps itself around us. Whether you're easing into sleep or simply seeking a soft pause from the day, I'm grateful to be part of your routine. Let me know where you're listening from. Are you watching the sunrise, or is the moon hanging outside your window as it is mine? If these calm historical narratives bring you peace, I invite you to subscribe and come along for many more. By the end of this video, you'll understand why some historians argue that the trenches of World War I were the most horrific living conditions human beings have ever endured. And I'm going to walk you through every nauseating detail. But first, let me tell you about a man named Albert, who kept a diary that somehow survived the war. Albert Carpenter was 19 when he first set foot in a French trench in 1916. He was supposed to be there for 6 months. He ended up staying for 2 years. His diary entries paint a picture so vivid and so disturbing that when his family found them decades later, they couldn't believe one person could survive what he described. His first entry reads like this: "The smell hits you first. It's not just death, though there's plenty of that. It's everything rotting at once. The wood, the sandbags, the men, the food, even the water tastes like decay. But you get used to it. You have to." What Albert didn't know on that first day was that he was about to become part of an underground city of misery, stretching over 400 miles across Western Europe. These weren't just holes in the ground. These were elaborate networks of tunnels, bunkers, and living spaces carved into the earth, where millions of men would spend years of their lives in conditions that would make a medieval dungeon look luxurious. The Western Front trench system was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Picture this. You're standing in a ditch, roughly 7 feet deep and 6 feet wide. The walls are held up by wooden planks, sandbags, and whatever debris the engineers could find. Above your head, maybe 8 feet up, is no man's land, a stretch of cratered, corpse-littered wasteland that could be anywhere from 50 yards to several miles wide, depending on where you were stationed. But here's where it gets interesting. You're not alone in this ditch. You're sharing it with anywhere from dozens to hundreds of other men, depending on the sector. And you're not just visiting. This is your home. For weeks, sometimes months at a time, you eat here, you sleep here, you fight here, and for many, you die here. The rats, though, they were the first thing every soldier mentioned. Albert wrote about them constantly. "They're everywhere," he noted in week 3. "Big as cats, some of them. They've gotten fat on the dead. You can hear them at night, scurrying through the walls, fighting over scraps. Sometimes you wake up, and one is sitting on your chest, just staring at you with these black eyes." But why were there so many rats? The answer is as simple as it is horrifying. The trenches were essentially giant feeding grounds. Bodies were everywhere. Not just enemy soldiers who had fallen in no man's land and couldn't be retrieved, but casualties from your own side who died during bombardments and had to be buried right there in the trench walls or floors because moving them was too dangerous. Private James Morrison from the Scottish Highlands described it this way: "We'd bury the lads right in the trench wall, cover them with a bit of wood and some dirt. But the rats, they knew. They always knew. You'd see them disappearing into these little holes, and you'd know they were getting to the bodies. Sometimes, after a heavy rain, parts would wash out. A hand here, a boot there. The rats would be waiting. These weren't ordinary rats either. The constant supply of human flesh had created a breed of super rats, massive creatures that had lost all fear of humans. They would steal food directly from soldiers' plates, chew through leather boots while men slept, and even attack wounded soldiers who were too weak to defend themselves." Albert's diary described one particularly horrific incident. "Henderson was wounded yesterday, took shrapnel in his leg. Couldn't move much. This morning we found him screaming. The rats had gotten to his bandages during the night and worse, much worse. Had to shoot him ourselves. couldn't let him suffer like that. But the rats were just the beginning of the biological nightmare that was trench life. The mud was another constant enemy, and I'm not talking about regular mud. This was a toxic soup of human waste, rotting flesh, chemicals from explosions, and whatever else had been ground into the earth over months of warfare. The consistency was unlike anything most soldiers had ever experienced. It wasn't just wet dirt. It was a thick, clinging substance that could trap a man completely. Soldiers would sink up to their waists and need multiple people to pull them out. Some weren't so lucky. Corporal William Hayes wrote to his wife, "The mud here isn't like the mud back home in the fields. It's alive somehow. It grabs at you. Yesterday, Thompson stepped off the duckboards and just vanished up to his chest. Took 4 of us pulling for 20 minutes to get him out. His boots never came up with him." These duckboards Hayes mentioned were narrow wooden walkways that ran along the bottom of trenches. They were supposed to keep soldiers out of the worst of the mud, but they were constantly breaking, shifting, or getting blown apart by shell fire. When that happened, men had no choice but to wade through the muck. The health consequences were immediate and severe. Trench foot became epidemic. This condition occurred when feet were constantly wet and cold, causing the flesh to literally rot away while still attached to the body. Soldiers would remove their boots to find their socks fused to their skin, or worse, their toes completely black and falling off. Medical Officer Captain Douglas Haig, not to be confused with the general of the same name, documented case after case. Saw Peterson today. Both feet completely black up to the ankles. The smell is indescribable. Had to amputate immediately, but I doubt he'll survive the infection. This is the 3rd case this week, and we're running out of morphine. The lice were another constant torment. Every soldier had them. There was no avoiding it. These weren't just annoying insects. They carried typhus and other diseases that could kill you. The lice would lay eggs in the seams of uniforms, and no amount of washing or burning could eliminate them completely. Albert described the daily routine. Every morning it's the same thing. Strip down, go through every seam of your uniform, crack the lice between your fingernails. Some of the lads have contests to see who can kill the most. Wilson got 47 yesterday, but it doesn't matter. By evening, you're crawling again. The psychological impact of living with constant parasites cannot be overstated. Men would scratch themselves raw, sometimes to the point of serious infection. The itching never stopped. It drove some soldiers to madness. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of trench life was how normal it all became. Albert's diary entries show this progression clearly. In his first week, every horror is described in detail. By month 3, he writes things like, "Found Peterson's head in the soup pot this morning. Bit annoying. Had to make new breakfast." The casual way soldiers began to discuss death, dismemberment, and disease shows how the human mind adapts to the unthinkable. Men would use corpses as furniture, turning bodies into tables or chairs. They would sleep next to the dead because there was nowhere else to go. Private Robert Chen, a Canadian soldier, wrote, "You stop seeing them as people after a while. They're just objects, obstacles, sometimes useful ones. Mackenzie's been dead for 3 days, but he makes a good windbreak when I'm trying to light a cigarette." The stench was omnipresent and indescribable. It wasn't just the smell of death, though that was certainly part of it. It was the combination of rotting flesh, human waste, poison gas residue, cordite from explosions, unwashed bodies, infected wounds, and food that had gone bad weeks ago but was still being eaten because there was nothing else. Men would tie cloth around their faces, but it did little good. The smell would permeate everything. It got into their hair, their skin, their clothes. Many soldiers reported that even years after the war, certain smells would instantly transport them back to the trenches. Albert noted, "You can't escape it." It's in your nose, your mouth, your lungs. Sometimes I dream about clean air, about the smell of my mother's kitchen, but I wake up and it's still there, always there. The food situation made everything worse. What passed for meals in the trenches would have been rejected by prisoners in the worst jails. The standard British ration consisted of hardtack biscuits, so stale they had to be soaked in tea or water just to be chewable. Canned beef that had often spoiled before it even reached the front lines, and jam that was frequently crawling with maggots. Albert's entries about food paint a picture of constant hunger mixed with revulsion. Today's beef was green around the edges, could smell it through the tin. But you eat it anyway because tomorrow there might be nothing at all. The jam had things moving in it, little white things. Jenkins said they were just rice, but rice doesn't wiggle. Water was even more problematic. The only source was often shell holes filled with rainwater, mixed with whatever chemicals had settled there from gas attacks and decomposing bodies. Purification tablets helped, but they couldn't remove the taste of death that seemed to permeate everything liquid in the trenches. Sergeant Major Patrick O'Sullivan from Dublin kept meticulous records of his unit's supplies. His notes reveal the desperate mathematics of survival. Day 12 without proper rations. Found a dead horse yesterday, mostly intact. Managed to carve off enough meat for the lads. Cooked it with our last bit of salt. Tasted like leather, but it was protein. But there was one substance that every soldier looked forward to that made the horror temporarily bearable. The rum ration. Twice daily, each man would receive a small measure of dark rum, usually diluted with water. This wasn't just about alcohol, it was about sanity. The rum ration became the most important moment of many soldiers' days. It dulled the pain, both physical and mental. It helped men sleep despite the constant bombardment. It gave them courage before going over the top. And for some, it became the only thing that made life worth living. Albert wrote extensively about the rum. The morning ration is salvation. You feel it burn down your throat, and for just a moment, the smell doesn't seem so bad. The rats don't seem so large. The mud doesn't feel so cold. William saves his up, drinks both rations at once in the evening, says it helps him forget where he is. Some soldiers became completely dependent on their rations. When supplies were delayed or cut off, men would go to extraordinary lengths to find alcohol. They would trade precious food, ammunition, even personal items for just a sip of rum from another unit. Private Thomas Blackwood from Yorkshire described the desperation. Haven't had rum in 4 days. Supply line got hit. Morrison tried to drink some medical alcohol yesterday. Nearly killed him. But I understood why he did it. Without the rum, you feel everything. Every smell, every sound, every awful thing about this place hits you all at once. The psychological impact of living in these conditions cannot be understated. Shell shock, what we now know as post-traumatic stress disorder, was rampant but poorly understood. Men would simply break down, unable to function. Some would stand and walk directly into enemy fire, preferring death to another day in the trenches. Albert documented several such incidents. Crawford just started walking today, right up the trench wall, over the top, straight toward the German lines. We called to him, but he didn't turn around, didn't run, just walked. The machine guns got him about 50 yards out, found a letter in his kit, just said, "I can't anymore," nothing else. The constant bombardment created its own form of torture. Artillery shells would rain down at all hours, day and night. The sound was beyond description. It wasn't just loud. It was a physical force that would shake your teeth, your bones, your internal organs. Men would huddle in dugouts, pressing themselves against the earth, praying that the next shell wouldn't be the one with their name on it. But it wasn't just the shells that exploded, it was the ones that didn't. Unexploded ordnance littered the trenches and no man's land. These duds, as they were called, could explode at any time. A soldier might lean against what looked like a harmless piece of metal, only to have it detonate, killing him and anyone nearby. Captain James Mitchell, an artillery officer, wrote about the psychological warfare of constant shelling. It's not meant to kill everyone, though it certainly does that. It's meant to drive men mad. The uncertainty is the weapon. You never know when the next one is coming, where it will hit, if you'll survive. Some men crack after days, others last months, but everyone breaks eventually. Between bombardments, there was an eerie quiet that was almost worse than the explosions. In the silence, you could hear everything. The moaning of wounded men in no man's land who couldn't be rescued, the skittering of rats through the walls, the wet, sucking sounds of men moving through the mud, your own heartbeat unnaturally loud in your ears. Albert captured this perfectly. The quiet times are the worst. During the shelling, you're too scared to think, but when it stops, that's when your mind starts working again. That's when you remember where you are, what you've seen, what you've done. The silence lets all the horror back in. Sleep became impossible for many soldiers. How do you rest when you're sharing your space with corpses, and rats are crawling over you, when the next shell might bury you alive? Men would go days without proper sleep, surviving on brief moments of unconsciousness stolen between bombardments. The lack of sleep created its own problems. Hallucinations became common. Men would see enemies that weren't there, hear voices calling for help from empty sections of trench. Some would have conversations with dead comrades, apparently unaware that their friends had been killed days earlier. Corporal David Price from Wales wrote, "Haven't slept properly in 8 days. Keep seeing movement where there isn't any. Yesterday I spent 20 minutes talking to Henderson about his wife back home. The lads had to remind me that Henderson died last Tuesday. I could have sworn he was sitting right there next to me. The medical situation was catastrophic. Field hospitals were overwhelmed, understaffed, and undersupplied. Wounded men would lie in the trenches for hours or days before receiving any treatment. Infection was almost guaranteed. Gangrene was common. Men would die from wounds that would have been easily treatable under normal circumstances. Dr. Elizabeth Morgan, one of the few female medical officers allowed near the front lines, kept detailed records of the conditions she encountered. Saw a boy today, couldn't have been older than 17. Shrapnel wound in his shoulder, not life-threatening under normal circumstances. But it had been festering for 5 days. The infection had spread down his entire arm. Had to amputate at the shoulder just to save his life. The tools available to medical personnel were primitive by today's standards. Surgery was performed with whatever instruments could be found, often without proper anesthesia. Morphine was rationed strictly, saved for the most severe cases. Men would have limbs amputated while fully conscious, biting down on leather straps to keep from screaming. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect was how young many of these soldiers were. Boys who should have been in school were instead learning how to kill, how to survive, how to die. Many had lied about their age to enlist, driven by patriotic fervour or family pressure. Albert wrote about one such boy. New kid arrived yesterday. Says he's 18, but he doesn't look a day over 15. Still has spots on his face. Keeps asking when he can write to his mother. Doesn't understand that mail only goes out if we're alive to send it. These young soldiers were forced to mature instantly or die. They learned to perform battlefield amputations on their comrades, to identify which wounds were fatal and which might be survivable, to make life and death decisions that would have challenged experienced doctors. The class system that defined British society was both maintained and destroyed in the trenches. Officers still ate better food and slept in slightly better conditions, but they also died in proportionally higher numbers. Leading from the front meant exactly that, and German snipers specifically targeted anyone who looked like they might be in command. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Wellington kept a journal of officer casualties in his regiment. Lost 3 lieutenants this week. Henderson on Monday, stepped on a mine. Cooper on Wednesday, sniper got him during morning inspection. Morrison yesterday, shell took his head clean off. These boys come from the best families in England, finest education money can buy, and they last about as long as anyone else out here. The social barriers that seemed so important back home became meaningless when you were sharing a shell hole with a man, regardless of his background. Aristocrats and labourers would huddle together for warmth, share their last piece of bread, hold each other as they died. Albert wrote about this levelling effect. Yesterday, Lord Pemberton's son was crying in his sleep again. Nightmares about his Batman who got blown apart 3 days ago. I held him like I would my own little brother back home. Don't matter what his father owns when you're both covered in the same mud, breathing the same stench of death. The hierarchy still existed on paper, but survival created its own democracy. The man who could keep a rifle working in impossible conditions, who could find food where others saw nothing, who could navigate the maze of trenches in complete darkness, that man commanded respect regardless of the medals on his chest or the accent in his voice. Winter brought an entirely new dimension of suffering to trench life. The cold was not just uncomfortable, it was lethal. Men would wake up to find their water frozen solid, their rifles too cold to fire properly, and their breath forming ice crystals that would cut their throats with each inhalation. Private Samuel Winters, whose name proved ironically prophetic, documented the brutal reality of his first winter in the trenches. Woke up this morning and couldn't feel my feet. Thought they were just numb from the cold, but when I tried to stand, I fell straight down. The boots were frozen to the duckboards. Had to pour warm tea over them to break the ice. Frostbite claimed as many casualties as enemy bullets during the winter months. Men would lose fingers, toes, entire hands and feet to the cold. The medical officers developed a grim expertise in cold weather amputations, sawing through frozen flesh that looked more like meat in a butcher's freezer than living human tissue. The combination of wet and cold created a special kind of agony. Soldiers would develop chilblains, painful swellings caused by repeated exposure to cold and damp. These would crack open, becoming infected wounds that never properly healed in the conditions of the trenches. Dr. Sarah Thompson, working in a casualty clearing station behind the lines, saw the results daily. They come in with their hands and feet looking like raw hamburger. The flesh just splits open from the cold. We do what we can, but infection is almost inevitable. Many of these boys will never use their hands properly again, assuming they survive at all. But the cold also brought one unexpected benefit. It slowed down the decomposition of corpses. Bodies that had been rotting quickly in warmer weather would freeze solid, reducing the smell somewhat. This created its own macabre problems, as frozen corpses became building materials, used to reinforce trench walls or create makeshift furniture. Albert noted this grim practicality. Henderson's been dead for 2 weeks now, frozen solid as a board. We propped him up in the corner and use him as a table for our cards. Sounds awful when I write it, but he's more useful now than he was alive. At least he doesn't complain about the food. The winter also meant longer nights, which brought extended periods of terror. Raids were more common under cover of darkness, and the long hours of blackness seemed to stretch endlessly. Men would huddle together, listening to every sound, trying to distinguish between the scurrying of rats and the approach of enemy soldiers. The psychological impact of these extended dark periods was severe. Some men developed what doctors called night blindness. Though it was more psychological than physical, they would claim they couldn't see anything after dark, even when conditions should have allowed for some vision. Captain Michael O'Brien, an Irish officer serving with a Scottish regiment, wrote about this phenomenon. Murphy says he can't see anything after sunset, claims everything goes completely black. But I've watched him. He can see fine. It's his mind that's shut down. He's protecting himself from seeing what happens in the dark. The spring thaw brought its own horrors. As temperatures rose and snow melted, the true extent of winter's carnage was revealed. Bodies that had been buried under snow for months emerged in various states of decomposition. The smell, which had been mercifully muted by the cold, returned with a vengeance. Worse, the thaw turned the already treacherous mud into something approaching liquid. Men would disappear completely into shell holes filled with melted snow and rainwater. Entire sections of trench would collapse as the frozen ground shifted and settled. Private William Henderson, no relation to the various other Hendersons mentioned in these accounts, described the spring of 1917. The whole world is melting. The mud is up to our waists in some places. Lost Jenkins yesterday. He was walking point and just stepped into what looked like solid ground. Went down like a stone. By the time we got ropes, he was gone. The psychological impact of watching comrades simply vanish into the earth was profound. It wasn't a heroic death in battle, or even the quick violence of a shell explosion. It was being swallowed alive by the very ground they were fighting to defend. Disease flourished in these conditions. Dysentery was rampant, leaving men weakened and dehydrated. Typhus spread through lice populations. Pneumonia claimed soldiers who had survived bullets and shells. The influenza pandemic of 1918 found fertile ground in the cramped, unsanitary conditions of the trenches. Medical officer Captain James Foster documented the spread of disease with clinical detachment. Influenza hit C Company hard this week. Started with Wilson on Monday, spread to half the company by Friday. These men have survived 2 years of warfare only to be laid low by a virus. The irony is not lost on anyone. The lack of proper sanitation created breeding grounds for every kind of disease. Latrines were often nothing more than holes in the ground, frequently contaminated by groundwater or damaged by shell fire. Men would relieve themselves wherever they could. Adding to the toxic hygiene became impossible. Soldiers might soup that surrounded them daily. Personnel go weeks or months without a proper bath. When they did get a chance to wash, it was usually in water that was questionably clean at best. Soap was a luxury item, traded like currency among the troops. Albert's diary entries about cleanliness reveal how dramatically standards had changed. Found a bar of actual soap yesterday. Real soap, not the lye stuff they sometimes give us. Traded my tobacco ration for it, worth every penny. First time I felt properly clean in 6 weeks. The impact on morale cannot be overstated. Men began to feel less than human, reduced to animals living in squalor. This dehumanization served a purpose in some ways, making it easier to kill enemy soldiers who were living in equally horrific conditions just yards away. But it also stripped away the civilized veneer that many of these men had grown up with. Letters home became increasingly censored, both by military censors and by self-censorship. Soldiers knew that describing their true conditions would horrify their families and potentially damage morale on the home front. They learned to write in code, to speak of hardships without revealing their true extent. Private Thomas Mackenzie wrote to his wife, "The accommodations here are quite rustic, my dear. Rather like camping, but with less comfortable bedding. The local wildlife is quite abundant, though not particularly friendly. Looking forward to returning to civilized society soon." Reading between the lines, his wife would have understood that he was living in conditions barely fit for animals, surrounded by vermin, in constant danger. But the careful language preserved the illusion that this was somehow a manageable hardship rather than a descent into hell. The mail system became a lifeline for soldiers' sanity. Letters from home were read and reread until they fell apart. Photographs of family members were kept in waterproof containers, treated like religious relics. Men would memorize every word of letters from sweethearts, reciting them during the worst moments as a form of psychological escape. But mail also brought its own form of torture. Dear John letters were common, as relationships strained under the pressure of separation and uncertainty. News of deaths at home, of businesses failing, of families struggling, all added to the psychological burden soldiers were already carrying. Albert received devastating news in the spring of 1917. Letter from mother today. "Father died last month. Consumption. She didn't want to tell me, thought it might distract me from my duties. My duties. As if anything here could be more important than being with family when they need you." The guilt of being away during family crises, combined with the impossibility of returning home, created another layer of psychological trauma. Soldiers felt they were failing not just as warriors, but as sons, husbands, and fathers. The constant presence of death created a strange relationship with mortality. Men became casual about their own deaths, making detailed plans for their personal effects, writing letters to be sent home if they were killed. This wasn't morbid obsession, but practical necessity. Corporal James Mitchell kept a detailed inventory of his possessions and their intended recipients. Watch to my brother William. Wedding ring to Margaret, obviously. Bible to mother, though she might not want it after what I've seen. Photographs to be burned. Don't want anyone remembering me looking like this. Some soldiers developed elaborate superstitions designed to keep them alive. Lucky charms, specific routines, articles of clothing that had to be worn in particular ways. These rituals provided a sense of control in a situation where death seemed completely random. Private David O'Sullivan carried a small stone from his family's farm in County Cork. This rock has been in our family for generations. My grandfather carried it through the Crimean War. My father through the Boer War. Now it's my turn. As long as I have this stone, I'll make it home. Whether these superstitions actually helped is unknowable, but they provided psychological comfort. In a world where shells could fall anywhere at any time, where a single step in the wrong direction could trigger a mine, where disease could strike without warning, the illusion of control was precious. The rats, meanwhile, continued to evolve and adapt. They learned to avoid certain areas during bombardments, somehow sensing when shells were about to fall. They developed pack-hunting behaviors, working together to bring down larger prey. Some soldiers swore they had seen rats using tools, manipulating objects to access food supplies. Sergeant Major Patrick Kelly documented increasingly disturbing rat behavior. The creatures have learned to open our ration tins. Saw one yesterday, manipulating a bayonet to pry open Wilson's bully beef. They're getting smarter, more aggressive. Yesterday, 3 of them cornered Morrison while he was changing his bandages, had to beat them off with a shovel. The psychological impact of sharing living space with increasingly intelligent and aggressive vermin added another layer to the mental strains soldiers were experiencing. Some men developed phobias so severe they would refuse to sleep, staying awake for days at a time to avoid rat encounters. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of rat evolution in the trenches was their growing boldness around human death. Rats would begin feeding on wounded soldiers before they had actually died, sensing weakness and vulnerability. Medical personnel reported cases of rats attacking patients in field hospitals, drawn by the smell of blood and infection. Dr. Margaret Williams, working in a forward aid station, documented these attacks. Had to post guards in the medical bay. The rats have learned that wounded men can't fight back effectively. Found them feeding on Peterson's leg wound yesterday while he was unconscious from morphine. The infection risk from rat bites is enormous. As the war dragged on, the psychological toll became as severe as the physical casualties. Shell shock manifested in dozens of different ways. Some men would shake uncontrollably, unable to hold a rifle or feed themselves. Others would become catatonic, staring blankly at nothing for hours at a time. The most disturbing cases were soldiers who seemed to function normally during the day, but would become completely different people at night. They would have conversations with dead comrades, following orders from officers who had been killed weeks earlier, performing duties for units that no longer existed. Captain Robert Fraser, a regimental psychiatrist, documented these cases. Private Williams appears completely normal during daylight hours, follows orders, performs his duties adequately. But after sunset, he becomes convinced he's still fighting at the Somme 2 years ago. He'll spend entire nights preparing for attacks that happened long ago, talking to men who died before he even arrived at the front. The military's understanding of psychological trauma was primitive at best. Men suffering from shell shock were often accused of cowardice, court-martialed, and in some cases executed for desertion. The concept that warfare could literally break a person's mind was not widely accepted by military leadership. This created another layer of trauma for soldiers experiencing psychological breakdown. Not only were they dealing with the horror of their experiences, but they were also facing potential execution if they couldn't hide their symptoms effectively. Private Matthew Thompson wrote about this fear. Davies has been acting strange since the big bombardment last week. Keeps talking to himself, jumping at every sound. We're all trying to cover for him, keep the officers from noticing. If they figure out he's cracked, they'll shoot him for cowardice. Better to die fighting than die as a coward. But Davies isn't fighting anymore. He's just surviving. The bonds between soldiers became incredibly strong under these conditions. Men would literally die for each other, not out of patriotism or duty, but out of love forged in shared suffering. These relationships were often deeper and more meaningful than any the soldiers had experienced in civilian life. Albert wrote extensively about his closest friend, a Welsh miner named Gareth Williams. Gareth saved my life yesterday, pulled me down just as a sniper's bullet went over my head. Didn't think, just acted. That's the third time he's done something like that. I'd do the same for him without hesitation. We've seen each other at our absolute worst, covered in our own filth, crying like babies. And we still care about each other. That's something special. These bonds often proved more durable than marriages or family relationships. Men who survived the war would maintain friendships with their trenchmates for the rest of their lives, unable to explain to anyone else what they had experienced together. The random nature of death in the trenches created its own psychological burden. There was no logic to who lived and who died. The best soldiers, the most careful ones, the lucky ones with good instincts. They all died just as easily as everyone else when a shell landed in the right spot. This randomness made it impossible to develop any sense of control or security. You could follow every rule, take every precaution, be the perfect soldier, and still die because you happened to be standing in the wrong place when physics and chance intersected. Corporal William Davis reflected on this cruel lottery. Henderson was the best soldier in our unit. Could shoot straighter than anyone, knew the trenches better than the engineers who built them, had survived 18 months without a scratch. Yesterday, he tripped over a duckboard and fell face first onto a piece of shrapnel. Bled out in 30 seconds. All that skill, all that experience, and he dies because he stumbled. As the war continued year after year, soldiers began to lose hope that it would ever end. The initial enthusiasm, the belief that they would be home by Christmas, gave way to a grim acceptance that this might simply be their life now. Some men couldn't even imagine returning to civilian society. The concept of returning home became almost abstract. Albert captured this disconnect perfectly. Received a letter from my sister today talking about the church social and Mrs. Patterson's new hat. It's like she's writing from another planet. I can barely remember what a church social is, let alone care about someone's hat. The world she's describing feels like something I dreamed once, long ago. This alienation from civilian life created another form of psychological prison. Even if they survived physically, many soldiers realized they were already lost to the world they had left behind. The experiences they had endured were so far outside normal human experience that they could never truly share them with anyone who hadn't been there. The addiction to rum became more severe as the war dragged on. What had started as a welcome relief became a desperate necessity for many soldiers. Men would hoard their rations, trade valuable possessions for extra alcohol, and some even resorted to drinking anything that contained ethyl alcohol, regardless of the consequences. Private Jeffrey Harrison documented his own descent into dependency. Haven't had my morning ration in 3 days due to supply problems. Hands won't stop shaking. can't hold my rifle steady. Found some medical alcohol in the aid station yesterday. Knew it might kill me, but the shaking was getting worse. Drank it anyway. Spent 6 hours vomiting, but at least my hands were steady. The military authorities were aware of the growing alcohol dependency among their troops, but they faced an impossible choice. Cutting off the rum rations would likely lead to mass psychological breakdown and potential mutiny. Continuing them meant sending already traumatized soldiers further into addiction. Captain Michael Stevens, a supply officer, wrote about this dilemma. The men need the rum to function, but it's destroying them in different ways. I've seen soldiers who can barely speak coherently during the day, but somehow manage to fight effectively when called upon. The alcohol is keeping them functional as soldiers while destroying them as human beings. Some enterprising soldiers found ways to create their own alcohol, using whatever materials they could find. Fermented fruit, potato peelings, even medical supplies could be converted into crude spirits. These homemade concoctions were often dangerous, causing blindness, organ failure, or death. But desperate men were willing to take the risk. Corporal James Macready, who had worked in a distillery before the war, became the unofficial brewmaster for his unit. Using potato peels and some sugar I traded for, managed to make something that burns going down and makes you forget where you are for a few hours. Not exactly smooth, but it does the job. Lost Thompson last week to a bad batch, but the rest of the lads keep asking for more. The constant fear of death created different coping mechanisms among different soldiers. Some became recklessly brave, volunteering for the most dangerous missions with a fatalistic acceptance that death was inevitable. Others became obsessively cautious, developing elaborate rituals and safety procedures that they believed would keep them alive. Albert observed both extremes in his unit. Mitchell has volunteered for every raid this month. Says he'd rather choose when he dies than wait for it to choose him. Meanwhile, Peterson checks his gas mask 17 times every morning and won't move without examining every inch of ground in front of him. Both strategies seem equally useless when the shells start falling. The gas attacks added another dimension of horror to trench life. Chemical weapons created a new kind of terror because they were invisible, silent, and could kill in ways that were particularly agonizing. Unlike bullets or shells, which killed quickly, gas could take hours or days to finish its work, leaving men conscious and aware of their slow death. The first indication of a gas attack was often the frantic ringing of bells or banging on metal objects. Soldiers had seconds to get their masks on properly, and a single mistake could mean death. The masks themselves were primitive, uncomfortable, and often ineffective against newer chemical agents. Private Daniel Murphy described his first gas attack. Heard the bells and got my mask on just as the cloud rolled over us. Couldn't see anything, couldn't breathe properly, felt like I was suffocating even though the mask was supposed to protect me. Lasted 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. When it cleared, found Rogers about 10 feet away. He hadn't gotten his mask on in time. Still conscious, but his lungs were destroyed. Took him 3 days to die. The aftermath of gas attacks was often worse than the initial exposure. Men would survive the immediate effects only to suffer permanent lung damage, blindness, or skin conditions that would plague them for the rest of their lives. The medical facilities were completely unprepared to deal with chemical weapon casualties. Dr. Patricia Henley worked in a casualty clearing station that specialized in gas victims. They arrived still alive, but already dying. The chlorine or mustard gas has destroyed their respiratory systems. We can make them comfortable, but there's nothing we can do to save them. They drown in their own fluids, fully conscious until the end. It's one of the most horrible ways to die I've ever witnessed. The psychological impact of gas attacks extended beyond the immediate casualties. Every soldier lived with the knowledge that invisible death could drift across the battlefield at any moment. The constant vigilance required, the need to sleep with gas masks within arm's reach, the terror of hearing those warning bells all added to the cumulative stress that was breaking men's minds. Some soldiers developed what doctors called gas hysteria, becoming convinced they were being poisoned even when no attack was occurring. They would refuse to remove their masks, even to eat or drink, and would report symptoms of gas exposure during clear weather with no enemy activity. Sergeant Major Robert Clark documented several such cases. Private Jenkins has been wearing his gas mask for 4 days straight, claims he can smell chlorine in the air, but there's been no enemy activity in our sector for weeks. Had to order him to remove the mask to eat, but he put it right back on. He's lost 15 pounds and can barely function, but he's convinced he'll die if he takes the mask off. The trenches themselves continued to evolve as the war progressed. What had started as temporary defensive positions became elaborate underground cities. Some sections had multiple levels, with living quarters, command posts, hospitals, and even recreational areas carved out of the earth. These improvements made life marginally more bearable in some ways, but they also meant that soldiers were spending even more time underground, further removed from sunlight, fresh air, and any connection to the natural world. Men would go months without seeing the sky clearly, living like moles in a maze of tunnels and dugouts. Albert described the expanded trench system. They've dug us a proper underground room now, 8 feet by 12, with wooden supports and everything. Supposed to be safer during bombardments, but it feels more like a tomb than a shelter. No windows, no natural light, just oil lamps that smoke and make the air even worse. Sometimes I think I'd rather take my chances in the open trenches. The deeper dugouts created new problems. Flooding was common, especially during heavy rains. Entire sections would fill with water, forcing men to evacuate to higher ground or risk drowning underground. The water would mix with sewage, rotting food, and decomposing bodies, creating a toxic soup that could kill through infection, even if you didn't drown. Private Samuel Taylor experienced one such flood. Woke up to water up to my chest. The whole dugout was filling fast. Grabbed my rifle and started climbing, but the ladder was slippery and men were panicking. Morrison didn't make it out. Found his body 3 days later when the water receded. Hadn't been shot. Hadn't been shelled. Drowned underground, like a rat in a sewer. The elaborate trench systems also created navigation problems. Men would get lost in their own defensive positions, wandering through miles of tunnels trying to find their units. Some soldiers disappeared entirely, presumably lost in collapsed sections or forgotten passages. Their bodies never recovered. Communication became increasingly difficult as the trench networks expanded. Messages had to be carried by runners who risked their lives crossing open ground or navigating the maze of tunnels. Many messages never reached their destinations, leading to units fighting without orders, reinforcements arriving at the wrong positions, and artillery firing on their own troops. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb wrote about these communication failures. Ordered 2nd Battalion to advance at dawn, but the runner never made it through. They sat in their trenches, while 1st Battalion went over the top alone. By the time we realised what had happened, 1st Battalion had been wiped out. 60 good men dead because one messenger caught a sniper's bullet. The constant digging required to maintain and expand the trench systems created another form of exhaustion. When soldiers weren't fighting, they were digging. When they weren't digging, they were repairing damage from the previous day's bombardment. There was never any rest, never any time to simply exist without some form of labour or danger. The tools available for this work were basic: shovels, pickaxes, and human muscle. Men would dig for hours in soil that was often frozen, waterlogged, or filled with debris from previous battles. Their hands would bleed, their backs would break, but the digging never stopped. Corporal William Foster documented the endless cycle of construction and destruction. Spent 12 hours yesterday digging out a new machine gun position. Good solid work, reinforced with timber, sandbags, the works. This morning, a single shell took it out in 2 seconds. Now we're digging again, same spot, same design. Tomorrow it'll probably get destroyed again. It's like being punished by the gods, building something just so it can be torn down. The psychological impact of this futility was enormous. Men would invest tremendous effort in creating defensive positions, only to watch them destroyed by random shell fire. The message was clear. Nothing they built, nothing they accomplished, had any permanence. Everything could be erased in an instant. This sense of futility extended beyond construction projects to the war itself. As months turned to years with no clear progress, soldiers began to question whether there was any purpose to their suffering. The grand speeches about glory and patriotism that had motivated them to enlist seemed increasingly hollow. Albert's diary entries reflect this growing disillusionment. Another big push yesterday. Gained maybe 50 yards of worthless mud at the cost of half the regiment. The generals will call it a victory, but what did we actually accomplish? We're still in the same trenches, facing the same enemy, dealing with the same rats and mud and death. Nothing changes, except the number of men in our unit keeps getting smaller. The rotation system that was supposed to give soldiers relief from frontline duty often provided little actual respite. Men would be moved to rest areas that were still within range of enemy artillery, still subject to air raids, still plagued by disease and poor living conditions. The only real difference was a slightly lower chance of immediate death. Private Thomas Anderson described one such rest period. They pulled us back to the reserve trenches for a week of rest, still sleeping in mud, still eating the same rotten food, still listening to shells falling nearby. Only difference is we're not shooting at anyone and no one's shooting directly at us. If this is rest, I'd hate to see what they consider hard duty. The mail system, which had been a lifeline early in the war, began to break down as the conflict dragged on. Postal services were disrupted by military action, censorship became more severe, and many soldiers found they had nothing left to say to the people back home. How do you write a cheerful letter when you're living in hell? Some soldiers stopped writing altogether, unable to maintain the fiction that they were fine. Others wrote increasingly cryptic messages, trying to communicate their reality through coded language that might slip past the censors. A few wrote brutally honest letters that they never sent, keeping them as a form of diary or confession. Albert attempted several letters that he never mailed. Dear Mother, I am writing to tell you that your son died months ago. I don't know who I am now, but it's not the boy who left home with such high hopes. This person living in the mud and filth. This creature that kills without thinking and watches friends die without crying. This is not your son. Please remember the boy who loved your cooking and worried about his school examinations. Forget about whatever comes home wearing his face. The concept of home itself began to fade for many soldiers. The longer they stayed in the trenches, the more alien civilian life seemed. Stories from home about everyday problems, social events, and normal human concerns felt like fiction from another world. When soldiers did receive news from home, it often created more problems than comfort. Learning about births, deaths, marriages, and other life events that they couldn't participate in made them feel even more isolated. They were missing the important moments of their families' lives while trapped in a nightmare of their own. Corporal David Price received news of his daughter's birth through a letter that took 6 weeks to reach him. Margaret gave birth to our little girl on the 15th. Named her Elizabeth after her grandmother. She's healthy and beautiful, according to the letter. But what kind of father am I? My daughter is 6 weeks old and I've never seen her, never held her. Don't even know if I'll live long enough to meet her. What if she grows up without ever knowing me, except as a name on a headstone? The guilt of missing these crucial family moments added another layer to the psychological burden soldiers were carrying. They felt they were failing as sons, husbands, and fathers, abandoning their responsibilities to their families for a war that seemed to have no end and no clear purpose. Some soldiers began to plan their post-war lives in elaborate detail, creating fantasy scenarios about returning home and resuming normal life. These plans became increasingly unrealistic as the war continued, but they served as psychological anchors, giving men something to hope for beyond mere survival. Private James Wilson spent hours describing his imagined homecoming. "When I get back, first thing I'll do is take the longest, hottest bath in history. Then I'll eat my mother's roast beef dinner, the one with the Yorkshire pudding and the gravy made from real beef drippings. After that, I'll sleep for a week in clean sheets that smell like soap instead of death." But even as they created these fantasies, many soldiers were beginning to realize that they would never be able to return to their old lives. The experiences they had endured had changed them too fundamentally. They were becoming aware that they were not the same people who had left home full of patriotic enthusiasm. The seasonal cycles in the trenches each brought their own particular miseries. Summer meant flies, which arrived in biblical proportions. They bred in the corpses, littering no man's land, and swarmed over everything: food, water, wounds, and sleeping men. The flies carried disease and made eating a constant battle. Private Robert Mitchell described a typical summer meal. "Trying to eat your rations becomes a fight with thousands of flies. They cover your food the moment you open a tin. You eat them along with everything else because there's no way to keep them out. The protein probably helps, but the thought of what they've been feeding on before landing on your dinner makes you sick." The flies were attracted to open wounds, making medical treatment even more difficult. Bandages would be black with insects within minutes of being applied. Men would develop secondary infections from fly-borne bacteria, turning minor wounds into life-threatening conditions. Autumn brought its own challenges as the rain returned and the temperature began to drop. The combination created perfect conditions for respiratory diseases, which spread rapidly through the cramped quarters. Men would develop pneumonia, bronchitis, and other lung ailments that their weakened bodies couldn't fight off. Dr. Margaret Foster documented the seasonal health patterns. Autumn is when we start losing men to disease rather than enemy action. Their immune systems are compromised by months of poor nutrition, lack of sleep, and constant stress. A simple cold can turn fatal in these conditions. The changing seasons also affected the rats, which would seek warmer shelter as temperatures dropped. This meant they became even more aggressive in invading human spaces, burrowing deeper into dugouts, and becoming more territorial about food sources. Throughout all of this, the military hierarchy continued to function, though it was increasingly strained by the reality of trench warfare. Officers were expected to maintain discipline and morale among men who were living in conditions that would break most civilians within days. Many officers struggled with the contradiction between their training and the reality they faced. They had been taught to lead by example, to maintain proper military bearing, to enforce regulations and discipline, but how do you maintain military standards when everyone is covered in filth, when regulations become meaningless for survival, when the traditional markers of rank and authority seem absurd in the face of shared misery? Lieutenant James Crawford wrote about this challenge. Tried to conduct a proper uniform inspection yesterday. Realized halfway through how ridiculous it was. Every man's uniform is rotted, stained with mud and blood, and worse. Their boots are falling apart. Their equipment is jury-rigged with whatever they could find. What's the point of military standard when we're all living like savages? Some officers adapted by becoming more like older brothers than military commanders, sharing the hardships and dangers while still providing leadership. Others retreated into rigid adherence to regulations as a way of maintaining some sense of order and normalcy. The most successful officers learned to balance military necessity with human compassion, understanding that their men needed both leadership and care. They would share their better rations with enlisted men, help with the worst duties, and provide emotional support while still maintaining the discipline necessary for military effectiveness. Captain William Foster became known throughout his regiment for this approach. The captain ate the same rotten food we did, slept in the same mud, and never asked us to do anything he wouldn't do himself. When Morrison cracked up during the big bombardment, the captain held him like a father while he cried. But when it came time to go over the top, we'd follow him anywhere because we knew he cared about keeping us alive. The bonds between officers and enlisted men became deeper and more personal than traditional military relationships. They were forged in shared suffering and mutual dependence. An officer's survival often depended on his men's loyalty, while the men's survival depended on their officer's competence and care. These relationships often transcended the class boundaries that had defined British society before the war. Working-class sergeants would become trusted advisors to upper-class lieutenants. Aristocratic captains would learn practical skills from common soldiers. The shared experience of the trenches created its own hierarchy based on competence and character, rather than birth and education. As the war continued into its third and fourth years, the psychological toll became visible in every aspect of military life. Courts-martial for desertion, self-inflicted wounds, and insubordination increased dramatically. Military hospitals filled with men suffering from shell shock, nervous breakdowns, and other psychological casualties. The military's response to these problems was often counterproductive. Men suffering from psychological trauma were frequently punished rather than treated, seen as cowards rather than casualties. This created additional fear among soldiers who were struggling with their mental health, forcing them to hide their symptoms and soldier on until they completely broke down. Private Daniel O'Brien witnessed several such breakdowns. Matthews just started screaming yesterday during the morning stand-to. Wouldn't stop, couldn't stop. Just kept screaming until his voice gave out, then kept trying to scream without any sound. They carried him away, and we heard later he was court-martialed for disturbing military discipline. Disturbing discipline. As if anything could be more disturbing than what we live with every day. The fear of being labelled a coward or deserter kept many soldiers fighting long after they had reached their psychological breaking points. They would continue to function mechanically, following orders and performing duties, while internally they had already surrendered to despair. This created armies of walking wounded, men whose bodies were intact but whose minds were shattered. They would serve effectively during combat, but would stare blankly at nothing during quiet periods, unable to engage with their surroundings or their comrades. The cumulative effect of all these factors, the rats and mud and disease and death and fear and exhaustion and hopelessness, was creating a generation of men who would never fully recover from their experiences. They were being transformed by conditions that pushed human endurance beyond all reasonable limits. Albert's final diary entries, written in the spring of 1918, just months before the war's end, capture this transformation. I don't remember what I used to worry about before the war. School examinations, whether girls liked me, what I would do for work. Those concerns seem like they belong to a different species, not just a different person. I can't imagine caring about such trivial things ever again. The irony was that many of these men, having endured the most extreme conditions imaginable, would survive the war only to struggle with peacetime. The skills that had kept them alive in the trenches, the psychological adaptations that had allowed them to function in hell, would prove maladaptive in civilian society. They had learned to live without hope for the future, to find meaning in simple survival, to form intense bonds with people who might die at any moment. They had learned to kill without hesitation, to watch suffering without flinching, to endure pain that would incapacitate normal people. These lessons would be difficult to unlearn when the war finally ended. The men who emerged from the rat-infested trenches of the First World War would carry their experiences with them for the rest of their lives, forever changed by conditions that had pushed human endurance to its absolute limits and beyond. But the transformation wasn't just psychological. The physical changes were equally profound and permanent. Men who had entered the war weighing a healthy 160 pounds would emerge as gaunt scarecrows, their bodies permanently altered by malnutrition, disease, and constant stress. Their teeth would be rotted from poor diet and lack of hygiene. Their skin would be scarred by shrapnel, marked by persistent rashes, and aged decades beyond their chronological years. Corporal Martin Hayes, who had been a robust farm worker before enlisting, documented his physical deterioration. Caught my reflection in a piece of broken mirror yesterday. Didn't recognize myself. My cheekbones stick out like knife blades. My eyes have sunk back into my skull, and my hair has gone completely grey. I'm 22 years old, and I look like my grandfather did before he died. The dental problems were particularly severe. Without proper nutrition or the ability to maintain oral hygiene, soldiers' teeth would literally fall out. Scurvy was common, causing gums to become swollen and bloody. Men would lose the ability to chew properly, forcing them to swallow their already inadequate rations without proper mastication. Private Thomas Ashford kept track of his dental decline. Lost another tooth yesterday. Just fell out while I was trying to eat that hardtack biscuit. That makes 7 so far. Can barely chew anything now. Morrison has started mashing up his rations with water to make a kind of gruel. Disgusting, but at least he can get it down. The skeletal changes were equally dramatic. Constant crouching in narrow trenches caused men to develop permanent spinal curvatures. Their shoulders would round forward. Their necks would crane at unnatural angles, and many would never again be able to stand fully upright. They were being literally reshaped by their environment. Dr. Sarah Richardson, examining soldiers on medical leave, documented these postural changes. They arrived looking like question marks. Months of living in cramped conditions have permanently altered their spinal alignment. Even when standing in open spaces, they instinctively hunch forward, as if still trying to avoid sniper fire or make themselves smaller targets. The constant dampness caused skin conditions that would plague survivors for decades. Chronic fungal infections, persistent rashes, and skin that had lost its natural elasticity from prolonged exposure to toxic mud. Some men developed a condition doctors called trench skin, where large patches would simply slough off, leaving raw, weeping wounds underneath. The respiratory damage from gas attacks, smoke, and constantly breathing the fetid air of the trenches would shorten lives for decades after the war ended. Men would develop chronic coughs, emphysema-like conditions, and lung scarring that made simple activities, like climbing stairs, an exhausting ordeal. Captain Robert Davies, a medical officer, tracked these long-term effects. The men who survive this war will carry it in their lungs for the rest of their lives. Every breath will remind them of the trenches. Many will die young from respiratory complications, their lungs destroyed not by bullets or shells, but by the very air they breathed while serving their country. But perhaps the most insidious physical change was the way constant stress had altered their nervous systems. Men would develop permanent tremors, their hands shaking uncontrollably even years after the war ended. Their reflexes would be hyperactive, causing them to jump at unexpected sounds or movements for the rest of their lives. The sleep disorders were equally permanent. Soldiers who had learned to sleep through artillery bombardments would find themselves unable to sleep in the quiet of peacetime. They had become so accustomed to constant noise and danger that silence itself became threatening. Private William Carrington wrote about this paradox. Strange thing happened on leave last month. Got to sleep in a proper bed for the first time in 2 years. Soft mattress, clean sheets, quiet room. Couldn't sleep at all. The silence was too loud. Kept waiting for the shells to start falling. Finally, had to go outside and sleep on the ground just to get some rest. The addiction to rum had created a generation of functional alcoholics who would struggle with dependency long after the war ended. The military's solution to psychological trauma had created another form of casualty. Men whose bodies craved alcohol with an intensity that civilian society couldn't understand or accommodate. Sergeant Major Patrick O'Sullivan observed the progression. started giving the lads rum to steady their nerves before battle. Now they need it just to function normally. Watch them in the morning before the ration arrives. Hands shaking, sweating, can't focus on simple tasks. The rum isn't helping them anymore. It's just keeping them from falling apart completely. Some soldiers had learned to distill their own alcohol from whatever organic matter they could find, developing skills that would serve them poorly in civilian life. They had become expert at creating intoxicating substances under the most primitive conditions, knowledge that would often lead them into conflict with peacetime authorities. The social skills necessary for civilian interaction had atrophied from disuse. Men who had spent years communicating primarily through military orders, desperate whispers during bombardments, or the grim humour of the trenches found themselves unable to engage in normal conversation. They had learned to find meaning in the smallest pleasures: a dry pair of socks, a piece of bread without mould, a few hours of sleep without interruption. These simple satisfactions had become so precious that the complex social rituals and material concerns of civilian life would seem impossibly trivial. Albert captured this disconnect perfectly. Received a letter from my cousin complaining about the quality of tea at his club, tea quality. I read it 3 times, trying to understand how anyone could care about such a thing. Yesterday I drank water that had been sitting in a shell hole for a week, mixed with God knows what, and was grateful to have it. The relationships these men had formed with death were unlike anything in normal human experience. They had watched friends die in hundreds of different ways, had killed enemy soldiers with their bare hands, had lived surrounded by corpses for so long that death had become mundane. This intimate familiarity with mortality would make it difficult for them to fear or respect the normal boundaries that kept civilian society functioning. They had seen that life was fragile, random, and ultimately meaningless in the face of industrial warfare. This knowledge would be impossible to forget or ignore. Corporal James Mitchell reflected on this transformation. Death used to be this mysterious, frightening thing. Now it's just another fact of life, like rain or hunger. You see it every day, in every possible form. After a while, you realize it's not the great mystery people think it is. It's just the end of breathing. Everything else is just poetry we tell ourselves to make it seem more important. The sensory memories would prove equally persistent. The smell of cordite would trigger immediate flashbacks decades later. The sound of thunder would send veterans diving for cover. The sight of rats would cause panic attacks that seemed completely disproportionate to the actual threat. Their nervous systems had been rewired by trauma, creating hair-trigger responses to stimuli that reminded them of the trenches. A car backfiring could send a veteran into a combat stance. The whistle of a factory could cause immediate terror as it mimicked the sound of incoming shells. Private David Henderson documented these triggers. Went to a fireworks display for the 4th of July. Thought it would be fun, reminded of better times. First explosion sent me flat on my face, crawling for cover. Took 3 men to convince me it wasn't artillery. My wife was mortified, but I couldn't help it. My body just reacted before my mind could catch up. The trust issues would prove equally challenging. Men who had seen their closest friends killed by random shellfire, who had watched officers make decisions that sent entire units to their deaths, who had learned that survival often depended on trusting no one but yourself, would struggle to form normal relationships. They had learned that anyone could die at any moment, that promises meant nothing when artillery started falling, that emotional attachments only made loss more painful. These hard-learned survival lessons would make peacetime relationships nearly impossible to maintain. The concept of planning for the future had been systematically destroyed by years of living moment to moment. In the trenches, thinking beyond the next few hours was not just pointless, but potentially dangerous. Men had trained themselves to exist entirely in the present, focused solely on immediate survival. Sergeant William Foster struggled with this limitation. People keep asking me what I want to do after the war, what my plans are, what I hope for. I can't think past tomorrow. Planning ahead feels dangerous somehow, like I'm tempting fate. In the trenches, The men who made long-term plans were usually the first to die. The hierarchy of human needs had been completely reordered. Maslow's pyramid had been inverted by trench warfare. Men who had once cared about social status, personal achievement, and self-actualization now cared only about basic survival: food, water, shelter, and avoiding immediate death. This reordering would make the complex social and economic structures of civilian life seem not just irrelevant, but actively hostile. Why should anyone care about fashion, entertainment, or social climbing when millions of men were dying in trenches? The contrast between trench priorities and civilian concerns would create a permanent sense of alienation. The efficiency of killing had been reduced to an industrial process, stripping away any romantic notions about warfare or heroism. These men had seen that modern warfare was simply mass production applied to human destruction. There was nothing noble or glorious about it, just systematic slaughter on an unprecedented scale. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Thompson reflected on this reality. We've turned killing into a factory operation. Artillery crews load shells like factory workers on an assembly line. Machine gunners mow down attacking soldiers like farmers harvesting wheat. There's no skill involved, no honor, no personal combat, just industrial efficiency applied to human extermination. This mechanical approach to death had dehumanized not just the enemy, but the killers themselves. Soldiers had learned to think of human beings as targets, objectives, obstacles to be overcome, rather than fellow people with families and dreams. The propaganda that had motivated them to enlist had been systematically destroyed by reality. The grand speeches about defending freedom, protecting civilization, and fighting the war to end all wars had been revealed as empty rhetoric in the face of the actual experience of trench warfare. Men who had believed they were fighting for great principles discovered they were actually fighting for the next meal, the next dry pair of socks, the chance to survive another day. The gap between the stated objectives and the daily reality had created a permanent cynicism about authority, government, and grand causes. Private Samuel Clarke captured this disillusionment. They told us we were fighting to make the world safe for democracy. Turns out we're fighting to keep from being eaten by rats. All those speeches about glory and honor, they don't mention the dysentery or the lice or watching your best friend's head get blown off his shoulders. The economic realities of warfare had also become starkly apparent. These men had seen how much money was being spent on instruments of destruction while they lived in conditions worse than animals. They had watched contractors grow rich, selling inferior equipment, while soldiers died from preventable causes. The contrast between the resources devoted to killing and the resources devoted to keeping soldiers alive had created a deep understanding of how little their lives actually mattered to the people making decisions. They were expendable resources, no different from ammunition or fuel. Corporal Michael O'Brien wrote bitterly, "Saw the quartermaster's books yesterday. They spend more money on a single artillery shell than they do feeding a soldier for a month. We're cheaper than the bullets they use to kill us." Really puts things in perspective. This knowledge would make it difficult for veterans to respect civilian authority or believe in the beneficence of government institutions. They had seen too clearly how little human life mattered when measured against political and economic objectives. The religious faith that had sustained many soldiers early in the war had been systematically destroyed by the reality of trench life. Men who had prayed for protection while watching good people die, horrible deaths, had lost their belief in divine intervention or cosmic justice. The randomness of death in the trenches had made it impossible to believe in a benevolent deity. If God existed, he was either powerless to stop the slaughter or didn't care enough to intervene. Either possibility made traditional religious faith untenable. Private Robert Williams struggled with this loss. "Used to pray before every battle, asking God to keep me safe, to watch over the lads, to help us get through another day. But then Henderson gets killed, and he was the most religious man in the unit. prayed more than anyone, helped everyone, never said a harsh word. If God lets Henderson die and keeps me alive, what does that say about divine justice? The chaplains who served in the trenches often found their faith tested as severely as the soldiers they were meant to comfort. How do you preach about God's love while standing knee-deep in mud mixed with human remains? How do you offer hope for salvation to men who are living in hell? Some chaplains adapted by focusing on practical comfort rather than spiritual guidance. They would help with medical care, share their rations with hungry soldiers, and provide emotional support without necessarily invoking divine intervention. Chaplain Father Michael McCarthy wrote about this evolution. I still conduct services, but mostly I just listen. These men don't need sermons about God's plan or divine purpose. They need someone to acknowledge that what they're experiencing is genuinely horrible, that their suffering is real and meaningful, even if it serves no higher purpose. The transformation of these men extended beyond individual psychology to their understanding of human nature itself. They had seen how quickly civilization could collapse, how thin the veneer of social order really was, how easily normal people could become capable of extreme brutality. This knowledge would make them permanent outsiders in peacetime society. They had seen behind the curtain of human civilization and discovered that it was held together by nothing more substantial than mutual agreement and shared illusion. They had learned that human beings were capable of adapting to any conditions, no matter how horrific, and that this adaptability was both humanity's greatest strength and its most terrifying weakness. People could become accustomed to anything, including systematic mass murder and living conditions that violated every standard of human dignity. Sergeant Major Thomas Anderson observed this adaptability. The most frightening thing isn't how horrible the conditions are. It's how normal they've become. We've adapted to living like animals, and we've done it so completely that civilian life now seems strange and artificial. We've forgotten how to be human beings. The men who survived the trenches would carry this knowledge with them forever. They had learned that civilization was fragile, that human nature was infinitely malleable, and that the comfortable assumptions of peacetime society were based on nothing more solid than the absence of extreme stress. This understanding would make them valuable witnesses to human resilience, but also permanent strangers in their own societies. They had been changed by their experiences in ways that could never be reversed, marked by conditions that pushed human endurance beyond all reasonable limits. The rats, the mud, the death, the disease, the constant fear and exhaustion and hopelessness had not just shaped their war experience. It had shaped them as human beings, creating a generation of men who would never again fit comfortably into the world they had fought to defend. Yet somehow, many of them would continue to function, to build families, to contribute to society, to find meaning and purpose in lives that had been fundamentally altered by their time in the trenches. Their resilience was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of their entire experience. They had survived conditions that should have destroyed them completely, and they had done it not through superhuman strength or exceptional courage, but through the simple human capacity to endure. They had learned that people could survive almost anything if they had to, and that knowledge would sustain them through whatever challenges peacetime might bring. The rat-infested trenches of the First World War had tested the absolute limits of human endurance, and somehow, impossibly, many of the men who experienced them had found ways to survive, not just physically, but psychologically. They had been transformed by conditions that no human being should ever have to endure, but they had endured them nonetheless. Their survival was a testament to the human capacity for adaptation, resilience, and the will to live even under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. They had proven that human beings could survive anything, even hell on earth, But survival came at a cost that wouldn't be fully understood until decades later. The men who emerged from these trenches carried with them a secret that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They had learned something about human nature that civilian society wasn't prepared to hear. Albert's final diary entry, written just weeks before the armistice, reveals this terrible knowledge. We've become something else down here. Not soldiers, not civilians, not quite human anymore. We're survivors of something that shouldn't exist. And the worst part is, we've proven that people can live through anything, absolutely anything. That knowledge feels more dangerous than any German bullet. The medical records from field hospitals tell a story that goes beyond physical wounds. Dr. Catherine Mills, working at a casualty clearing station near Arras, documented changes in soldiers that had nothing to do with enemy action. They arrive with a look in their eyes that I've never seen before. It's not fear, not exactly. It's recognition. They've seen something that most humans never see, and it's changed them at a fundamental level. What Dr. Mills was observing was the result of prolonged exposure to conditions that violated every assumption about human civilization. These men had lived in a world where the normal rules didn't apply, where survival required abandoning everything they had been taught about morality, dignity, and human worth. The transformation wasn't gradual. Men could pinpoint the exact moment when something inside them had broken or changed forever. For some, it was watching a friend die slowly from gas poisoning. For others, it was the first time they had eaten food knowing it was contaminated with human remains because the alternative was starvation. Private Edward Harrison remembered his moment of transformation with perfect clarity. It was day 43 in the Somme sector. Found a piece of chocolate in a dead German's pocket. Hadn't had anything sweet in 3 months. Ate it while sitting on his chest because there was nowhere else to sit. Didn't feel guilty, didn't feel sick, didn't feel anything. That's when I knew I wasn't the same person who had left home. Or the dehumanization process was systematic and complete. Men learned to see corpses as furniture, wounded comrades as burdens, and enemy soldiers as problems to be solved rather than people to be killed. This mental shift was necessary for survival, but it came at a psychological cost that would last lifetimes. The rats, meanwhile, had evolved into something that challenged every assumption about animal behavior. By 1918, they had developed pack hunting strategies that allowed them to bring down wounded soldiers. They had learned to distinguish between the living and the dead, often beginning to feed on men who were still breathing, but too weak to resist. Corporal James Whitfield documented increasingly disturbing rat behavior. They've started working together in ways I've never seen. Yesterday, watched a group of 6 rats coordinate an attack on Peters while he was unconscious from morphine. 2 held down his arms while the others went for his throat. Had to beat them off with a shovel, but they regrouped and tried again 20 minutes later. The intelligence displayed by these creatures became a source of particular psychological horror for soldiers. They were sharing their living space with animals that seemed to understand human weakness and vulnerability. Some men became convinced that the rats were deliberately tormenting them, displaying a malevolence that went beyond simple survival instinct. The size of individual rats had reached proportions that strained credibility. Multiple independent sources describe specimens that weighed over 5 pounds, larger than many cats. These monsters had been feeding on human flesh for so long that they had developed a preference for it over traditional food sources. Private Thomas Mackenzie encountered one such creature. Thing was sitting on Henderson's chest when I found him this morning. Must have weighed 8 pounds, easy. When it saw me coming, it didn't run, just sat there staring, like it was claiming territory. Had to hit it 3 times with my entrenching tool before it finally died. Even then, it tried to bite me while I was killing it. Afit, the psychological impact of sharing living space with such creatures cannot be overstated. Men developed phobias that would last decades. Some became unable to enter small spaces, convinced that rats were waiting in every dark corner. Others developed obsessive behaviors around food storage, unable to leave anything edible unguarded even in peacetime. The winter of 1917 brought conditions that pushed human endurance beyond what anyone had thought possible. Temperatures dropped so low that exposed skin would freeze within minutes. Men would wake up to find their rifles frozen solid, their water supplies turned to ice, and their breath forming crystals that would cut their throats with each inhalation. But the cold also brought unexpected revelations about human adaptability. Soldiers discovered that they could survive temperatures that should have killed them by sharing body heat, by learning to recognize the early signs of frostbite, and by developing an almost supernatural ability to find shelter in the most unlikely places. Sergeant William Crawford documented these survival adaptations. Amazing what the human body can learn to tolerate. Yesterday, it was 30 below, and Thompson was walking around in just his undershirt, claimed he was too hot. His body had adapted so completely to the cold that normal winter temperatures felt tropical to him. The medical implications of these adaptations were profound. Men's metabolisms had changed, their circulation patterns had adapted, and their nervous systems had been rewired to function under extreme stress. They had become, in a very real sense, a different subspecies of human being. Dr. Margaret Foster, examining soldiers on medical leave, was amazed by the physiological changes. Their resting heart rates are 40% higher than normal. Their blood pressure is consistently elevated. Their bodies are in a constant state of fight or flight response, even when they're sleeping. It's as if they've evolved to live in a state of perpetual crisis. The psychological changes were equally dramatic. Men had learned to function without hope, to find meaning in simple survival, to form intense emotional bonds that could be severed by death at any moment without causing complete breakdown. They had developed emotional calluses that protected them from the constant trauma of loss. But these same adaptations that kept them alive in the trenches would make peacetime relationships nearly impossible. They had learned not to invest too deeply in other people, not to plan for the future, not to expect anything beyond basic survival. These lessons would be difficult to unlearn. The addiction to rum had evolved beyond simple alcoholism into something more complex and dangerous. Men had learned to use alcohol not just for intoxication, but as medicine, as disinfectant, as currency, and as a measuring stick for the passage of time. Their relationship with drinking would never be normal again. Private Daniel Morrison kept detailed records of his rum consumption and its effects. 3 ounces this morning to stop the shaking. 2 more at noon to kill the pain in my leg where the shrapnel is still working its way out. Another 4 ounces tonight to help me sleep through the bombardment. Tomorrow, I'll need more to function at all. The tolerance levels these men developed were superhuman. Amounts of alcohol that would kill civilians were barely enough to help them function. Their livers had adapted to process ethanol at rates that seemed impossible. But this adaptation came with a price that would be paid over decades. The social drinking customs that had existed before the war were completely destroyed by trench experience. These men had learned to drink for effect, not for pleasure. They drank to forget, to function, to survive. The social rituals around alcohol consumption seemed meaningless to people who had used liquor as a tool for psychological survival. The food situation had created its own form of adaptation that went beyond simple malnutrition. Men had learned to eat things that would have been unthinkable in civilian life. They had developed the ability to identify edible substances in environments where traditional food sources were non-existent. The psychological relationship with food had been permanently altered. Men who had gone days without eating, who had shared scraps with rats, who had eaten food they knew was contaminated because the alternative was starvation, would never again take meals for granted. Corporal Michael Stevens wrote about this transformation. Ate a piece of bread yesterday that was completely green with mold, tasted like death, but it was calories. Before the war, I would have thrown it away without thinking. Now I'm grateful for anything that might keep me alive another day. That change in perspective feels permanent. The class distinctions that had defined British society were being systematically destroyed by shared suffering. Aristocratic officers were learning practical skills from working-class soldiers. Educated men were discovering that survival often depended on knowledge that couldn't be found in books. This leveling effect created bonds that transcended traditional social boundaries. Men who would never have spoken to each other in civilian life became closer than brothers. The artificial barriers that separated social classes seemed absurd when everyone was equally covered in mud and equally likely to die at any moment. Lieutenant Charles Wellington wrote about this social transformation. "My Batman, Jenkins, saved my life yesterday by recognizing the sound of an incoming shell before I did." His working-class background gave him knowledge that my expensive education never provided. In the trenches, competence matters more than pedigree. But this democratization of suffering also meant that the traditional sources of authority and leadership were being questioned. Men who had learned to make life and death decisions based on practical knowledge rather than formal rank were developing a skepticism about hierarchy that would outlast the war. The concept of heroism itself was being redefined by trench warfare. Traditional notions of courage and valor seemed meaningless when survival often depended on luck rather than bravery. The men who lived were not necessarily the most heroic, just the most fortunate or the most adaptable. This randomness of death created a new understanding of what constituted meaningful action. Men learned to measure heroism not by grand gestures, but by small acts of kindness, by sharing scarce resources, by maintaining humanity under inhuman conditions. Private Robert O'Connor reflected on this new definition of courage. "Real bravery isn't charging machine gun nests, it's sharing your last piece of bread with a wounded man. It's staying awake on watch when you haven't slept in 3 days. It's holding a dying friend's hand when you know you might be next." The religious faith that had sustained many soldiers was being tested in ways that formal theology had never anticipated. How do you maintain belief in divine benevolence while living in conditions that seemed designed by a malevolent deity? Some men lost their faith entirely, unable to reconcile their experiences with any concept of a loving God. Others developed a darker, more complex relationship with spirituality that incorporated the reality of seemingly random suffering. Chaplain Father Thomas Kelly struggled with these questions. How do I preach about God's love to men who are living in hell? How do I talk about divine justice when good men die and evil men survive? The traditional answers don't work anymore. We need a new theology for this new kind of warfare. The letters home became increasingly difficult to write as the gap between trench reality and civilian understanding widened. Men found themselves unable to communicate their experiences to people who had no frame of reference for such extreme conditions. The censorship system, both official and self-imposed, meant that the true nature of trench warfare was being systematically hidden from civilian populations. This created a conspiracy of silence that would isolate veterans for decades after the war ended. Albert struggled with this communication barrier. How do I tell my mother that I watched my best friend get torn apart by shrapnel yesterday? How do I explain that we buried him in pieces because that's all we could find? There are no words for this experience that civilians could understand. The isolation created by this communication gap was almost as difficult to bear as the physical conditions of the trenches. Men felt that they were fighting not just enemy soldiers, but also the growing disconnect between their reality and the world they were supposedly defending. The concept of time had been altered by trench warfare. Days were measured not by clocks, but by bombardments, by meal rations, by the arrival of mail. The normal rhythm of civilian life seemed artificial and meaningless to men whose time was divided between periods of terror and periods of boredom. This temporal displacement would make it difficult for veterans to readjust to peacetime schedules and routines. They had learned to live entirely in the present moment, to respond to immediate threats and opportunities without regard for long-term planning. Private Samuel Hughes described this altered relationship with time. Minutes during a bombardment feel like hours. Weeks in the trenches feel like minutes. I've lost all sense of normal time. Christmas came and went, and I barely noticed. Time only matters when shells are falling. The seasonal cycles, which had once provided structure and meaning to rural life, became markers of suffering rather than natural progression. Spring meant mud and exposed corpses. Summer meant flies and disease. Fall meant rain and cold. Winter meant death from exposure. The natural world itself seemed to have been corrupted by warfare. Plants grew from soil fertilized with human remains. Animals fled the area entirely, or, like the rats, adapted to feed on the products of human destruction. The landscape itself bore scars that would last generations. This environmental destruction added another layer to the psychological trauma soldiers were experiencing. They were witnessing the systematic destruction of the natural world they had grown up loving and respecting. Corporal David Price wrote about this ecological devastation. There are no birds here anymore. No insects except the flies that feed on corpses. No flowers, no grass, nothing growing except in places where men have died. We've turned this entire region into a wasteland that may never recover. War. The long-term implications of this environmental destruction would not be fully understood for decades. The soil itself had been poisoned by chemicals from gas attacks and explosive residue. The water table had been contaminated by human and chemical waste. The ecosystem had been so thoroughly disrupted that normal recovery might take centuries. But perhaps the most profound change was in the soldiers' understanding of human nature itself. They had learned that people could adapt to any conditions, no matter how horrible. They had seen that civilization was a much thinner veneer than anyone had previously understood. This knowledge would make them permanent outsiders in peacetime society. They had seen behind the comfortable assumptions that allowed civilian life to function. They knew how quickly social order could collapse, how easily normal people could become capable of extreme actions. The men who survived the rat-infested trenches of World War I would carry this terrible knowledge with them for the rest of their lives. They had been witnesses to the ultimate test of human endurance, and they had passed that test at a cost that could never be fully calculated. Their survival was proof of human resilience, but it was also proof of human adaptability to conditions that should never exist. They had learned that people could live through anything, and that lesson would haunt them forever. The transformation was complete and irreversible. These men would never again be able to live as if they didn't know what human beings were capable of enduring. They had been changed at the most fundamental level by their time in the trenches. Yet somehow, many would find ways to build meaningful lives after the war. They would marry, raise children, contribute to society, and create beauty in a world they had seen at its most ugly. Their resilience was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of their entire experience. They had proven that human beings could survive the unsurvivable, endure the unendurable, and somehow find ways to continue living even after experiencing hell on earth. The rat-infested trenches had tested them beyond all reasonable limits, and they had emerged scarred but unbroken. Their story was one of horror, yes, but it was also one of the ultimate triumph of human will over impossible circumstances. They had faced the worst that warfare could offer, and had somehow found ways to maintain their humanity even in the most inhuman conditions imaginable. The legacy of their experience would shape the 20th century in ways that are still being understood today. They had participated in humanity's first truly industrial war, and they had learned lessons about human nature that would influence everything from psychology to philosophy to the conduct of future conflicts. But in the end, their most important achievement was simply this: they had survived. Against all odds, despite conditions that should have destroyed them completely, they had found ways to keep living, keep fighting, and keep hoping for something better. The rats, the mud, the death, and the despair had not conquered them. They had conquered it instead, through nothing more than the simple, stubborn refusal to give up. That refusal, that determination to survive no matter what, was perhaps the most human thing about them. They had survived, but survival in the trenches meant something entirely different from what civilians could comprehend. It meant waking up each morning to discover which of your friends had died during the night. It meant learning to distinguish between the different sounds rats made when they were feeding on fresh corpses versus old ones. It meant developing the ability to sleep while standing up in knee-deep mud, because lying down meant drowning. Private Jonathan Fletcher had mastered this art of vertical sleeping by his 6th month in the trenches. He would wedge himself between 2 wooden support beams and somehow find unconsciousness while remaining upright. His body had learned to recognize the subtle changes in artillery patterns that meant he had perhaps 20 minutes of relative safety. But even sleep brought no relief from the horror. Dreams became indistinguishable from waking reality. Men would dream of clean beds and hot meals, only to wake up with rats nibbling on their fingers. Others would dream they were still fighting battles from weeks earlier, swinging their fists at imaginary enemies while their bunkmates tried to restrain them. The nightmare quality of trench life extended beyond individual psychology into the realm of collective madness. Entire units would develop shared delusions, convinced they could hear music playing from no man's land or see lights moving where no lights should exist. These mass hallucinations became so common that medical officers had to develop protocols for distinguishing between genuine threats and collective psychological breaks. Captain William Morrison documented one such incident. The entire 2nd Platoon reported enemy movement in Sector 7 last night, spent 4 hours preparing for an attack that never came. When dawn broke, Sector 7 was empty, except for the same corpses that had been there for 3 weeks. 30 men had simultaneously hallucinated the same phantom enemy. The shared nature of these experiences created a form of collective trauma that went beyond individual shell shock. Men were not just dealing with their own psychological damage, but with the accumulated mental strain of their entire unit. The madness was contagious, spreading through companies like a psychological epidemic. Food became the central obsession around which all other concerns revolved. Men would spend hours discussing meals they had eaten years earlier, describing in elaborate detail the texture of their mother's bread or the exact flavor of fresh milk. These food fantasies became a form of mental escape that was both comforting and torturous. The official rations had devolved into something that challenged the definition of food self. Bully beef arrived in tins so corroded that the contents were often green before being opened. Hardtack biscuits required soaking in whatever liquid was available, usually water of questionable origin, just to become soft enough to chew without breaking teeth. Private Marcus Webb kept detailed records of his daily caloric intake and its effects on his body. Day 73. Breakfast was half a tin of bully beef that smelled like sulphur and tasted worse. Lunch was a piece of hardtack that had been soaked in rainwater from a shell hole. Dinner was the other half of the beef tin. Estimate total calories at maybe 800. Lost another notch on my belt. Can count my ribs clearly now. The hunger was constant and all-consuming. Men would find themselves dreaming about food more than they dreamed about home or safety. The physical sensation of an empty stomach became so familiar that feeling full seemed unnatural and alarming. This chronic malnutrition had profound effects on cognitive function. Men found it difficult to concentrate, to make complex decisions, or to remember recent events clearly. The brain, deprived of adequate nutrition, began to shut down non-essential functions to preserve basic survival processes. Sergeant David Collins noticed these changes in his own thinking. Used to be able to do mathematics in my head, plan complex operations, remember detailed orders. Now I struggle to count my remaining ammunition or remember what day it is. My mind feels like it's wrapped in cotton wool, everything muffled and slow. The psychological impact of watching your own mental faculties deteriorate added another layer of horror to the trench experience. Men were not just physically wasting away, but mentally diminishing, losing the very qualities that made them who they were. The rum ration remained the only reliable pleasure in this world of deprivation, but its effects were becoming increasingly problematic. What had started as medicinal alcohol had evolved into a dependency so severe that men would trade anything for extra rations. Wedding rings, family photographs, even ammunition changed hands in exchange for a few extra ounces of rum. The quality of the alcohol itself was often questionable. Supply lines were unreliable, and desperate quartermasters would accept whatever spirits they could obtain. Industrial alcohol, medical spirits, and even homemade concoctions of dubious origin all found their way into the daily rations. Private Thomas Anderson discovered the dangers of this variability. Yesterday's ration tasted different, burned more going down. Within an hour, half the company was violently ill. 3 men went completely blind, probably permanently. But we kept drinking it because the alternative was facing this place completely sober. The blindness caused by wood alcohol was becoming increasingly common as the war dragged on and supply quality deteriorated. Men would choose temporary relief from psychological pain, even if it meant permanent physical disability. The calculation was simple: better to be blind than to see clearly what surrounded them every day. The addiction had reached levels where men would begin experiencing withdrawal symptoms within hours of missing their rations. Hands would shake uncontrollably, making it impossible to aim a rifle or perform basic tasks. Sweating, nausea, and hallucinations would follow, creating additional medical casualties in units that were already undermanned. Dr. Elizabeth Harper documented the progression of alcohol dependency among the troops. They arrive at the aid station with symptoms indistinguishable from advanced alcoholism: delirium tremens, liver damage, neurological impairment. These are not men who have been drinking for decades, but boys who have been consuming military alcohol for months. The social structure within the trenches had evolved to accommodate and enable this widespread addiction. Men would pool their rations, saving them for special occasions or distributing them to those most in need of psychological relief. A complex economy developed around alcohol trading that paralleled but often superseded the official military hierarchy. The rats, meanwhile, had developed behaviours that seemed almost deliberately designed to torment the human inhabitants of the trenches. They had learned to time their most aggressive activities to coincide with periods when soldiers were most vulnerable. During bombardments, when men were huddled in dugouts unable to defend themselves, the rats would become particularly bold. Corporal James Patterson observed this tactical behaviour. They know when we're pinned down. During yesterday's artillery barrage, while we were all pressed against the walls trying not to get buried alive, the rats went through our packs systematically, opened ration tins, contaminated our water supplies, even chewed through ammunition belts. They're not just scavenging anymore, they're conducting organised raids. The intelligence displayed by these creatures had evolved beyond simple problem solving into what appeared to be strategic thinking. They would post sentries while others fed, coordinate attacks on wounded soldiers, and even seem to communicate information about human weaknesses and vulnerabilities. Some rats had learned to mimic the sounds of wounded men, making crying or moaning noises that would draw soldiers into ambushes. Others had developed the ability to open complex latches and containers, accessing food supplies that had been carefully secured against human theft. The psychological warfare aspect of rat behavior was perhaps the most disturbing development. These creatures seemed to understand that they could break human morale through persistent harassment. They would steal small personal items that had sentimental value, leaving more valuable military supplies untouched. Private William Davies lost his most treasured possession to this psychological terrorism. Had a photograph of my daughter, only picture I owned. Kept it wrapped in oilcloth in my inside pocket. Never took it out except to look at it for a few seconds each night. Woke up yesterday morning to find a rat had somehow gotten into my jacket and shredded it completely. left everything else alone, just destroyed the one thing that mattered most to me. The seasonal changes brought new dimensions of suffering that tested human adaptability in different ways. Spring meant the great thaw, when months of accumulated corpses would emerge from melting snow in various stages of decomposition. The smell during these periods was indescribable, a mixture of rotting flesh, chemical residue, and organic decay that seemed to penetrate everything. The spring thaw of 1918 revealed the true scope of the carnage that had accumulated during the winter months. Bodies that had been buried under snow for months emerged in grotesque poses, some still clutching weapons or personal items. The sight of these winter casualties had a profound psychological impact on soldiers who had somehow managed to maintain their mental equilibrium during the coldest months. Sergeant Robert Mitchell wrote about this annual revelation. Every spring is like opening a mass grave. The snow melts away, and there they all are, the boys who died during the winter, perfectly preserved by the cold. You see faces you recognize, men you served with, friends you thought had just gone missing. They've been there all along, waiting under the snow. The preservation effect of freezing temperatures meant that many corpses retained lifelike appearances, creating the illusion that they might somehow still be alive. Men would find themselves talking to frozen bodies, asking them questions, waiting for responses that would never come. This phenomenon created a new category of psychological disturbance that medical officers struggled to classify. Men would develop attachments to specific corpses, visiting them daily, caring for them as if they were still living comrades. The boundary between life and death had become so blurred that distinguishing between them required conscious effort. The mud itself had evolved into something that defied natural description. It was no longer simply earth mixed with water, but a toxic amalgamation of soil, human waste, decomposing organic matter, chemical residue from gas attacks, and the accumulated detritus of industrial warfare. This substance had its own ecosystem, supporting forms of bacterial life that had never been documented by science. The consistency varied depending on weather conditions and location, but it was universally hostile to human life. In some areas, it was liquid enough to drown in. In others, it had the consistency of concrete, making movement almost impossible. Everywhere, it was contaminated with pathogens that could cause infection through the smallest break in the skin. Private Charles Henderson learned about the mud's toxicity through direct experience. Cut my hand on a piece of shrapnel yesterday. Tiny wound, barely bleeding. By this morning, my entire arm was swollen and red. The infection from the mud had spread faster than anything I've ever seen. Doc says I'm lucky it didn't reach my bloodstream or I'd be dead by now. The medical implications of constant exposure to this contaminated environment were staggering. Every soldier suffered from chronic skin conditions, persistent infections, and digestive problems from inadvertently consuming trace amounts of the toxic mud. The cumulative health effects would plague survivors for decades after the war ended. The mud also had psychological effects that went beyond physical discomfort. Men began to feel that they were being consumed by the earth itself, that the trench system was a living entity that fed on human suffering. The sensation of being slowly absorbed into the ground created claustrophobic panic that could paralyze soldiers with fear. Corporal Michael O'Sullivan documented this psychological phenomenon. Thompson refuses to go below ground level anymore. Says the earth is trying to swallow him. He'll stand in the open trench during bombardments rather than take shelter in a dugout. Would rather die from shrapnel than be buried alive by mud. The clothing and equipment issued to soldiers had proven completely inadequate for the conditions they faced. Uniforms designed for traditional warfare fell apart within weeks of trench duty. Boots disintegrated in the constant moisture, leaving men with feet wrapped in whatever fabric they could find. The improvisation required to maintain basic equipment became a survival skill that separated veterans from new arrivals. Men learned to repair boots with strips of leather cut from corpses, to waterproof clothing with fat rendered from dead animals, to create tools from battlefield debris. Private Edward Walsh became expert at equipment improvisation. Made a new sole for my left boot using leather from a German officer's holster. Held it on with wire stripped from telephone cables. Not pretty, but it keeps my foot off the ground. My rifle sling is made from bandages soaked in grease from a dead horse. Works better than the original. This constant need for improvisation created a culture of resourcefulness that would serve veterans well in civilian life. But it also reinforced the sense that they were living in a world where normal rules and expectations no longer applied. Everything was temporary. Everything was improvised. Nothing could be taken for granted. The mail system, which had once provided crucial psychological support, began to break down as the war entered its final phases. Letters took months to reach their destinations, if they arrived at all. Men would receive news of events that had occurred so long ago that the information felt like ancient history. The disconnection from home became more profound as communication deteriorated. Soldiers began to feel that they were living in a separate reality that had no connection to the civilian world. The people they had left behind seemed like characters from a half-remembered story, rather than real individuals they would someday rejoin. Albert's later diary entries reflect this growing alienation. Received a letter today from my sister, postmarked 3 months ago. She writes about a church social and asks if I'm staying warm. How do I respond to such innocent questions? How do I explain that warmth is a concept that no longer has meaning, that church socials exist in a universe I can barely remember? The gap between civilian concerns and trench reality had become so wide that meaningful communication was almost impossible. Men found themselves unable to relate to the problems and preoccupations of people who had never experienced extreme conditions. This communication breakdown created additional psychological isolation for soldiers who, with the trauma of their daily, were already dealing existence. They were cut off, not just physically from home, but emotionally and intellectually as well. The leadership structure within the trenches had evolved to reflect the reality that survival often depended on practical knowledge rather than formal rank. Non-commissioned officers who understood the intricacies of trench warfare became more influential than commissioned officers with superior education but less experience. This practical meritocracy created tensions within the traditional military hierarchy. Orders from headquarters that ignored trench realities were increasingly ignored by frontline troops, who had learned that following such orders meant certain death. Lieutenant James Crawford wrote about this erosion of traditional authority. My sergeant knows more about keeping men alive than I do, and everyone in the company knows it. When he suggests we ignore orders from headquarters, I listen. My expensive education taught me nothing about surviving in these conditions. The development of this alternative hierarchy based on competence rather than rank would have lasting implications for post-war society. Men who had learned to evaluate leadership based on results rather than credentials would be skeptical of authority figures who lacked practical experience. The concept of heroism itself had been completely redefined by trench warfare. Traditional notions of courage and valor seemed meaningless when death was usually random rather than the result of brave or cowardly actions. Men learned to find meaning in small acts of kindness and mutual support rather than grand gestures. The heroes of trench warfare were not necessarily the men who charged enemy positions, but those who shared their rations with wounded comrades, who volunteered for dangerous missions to help their units, who maintained their humanity under inhuman conditions. Corporal William Foster exemplified this new definition of heroism through his daily actions rather than any single dramatic event. Foster never did anything that would earn him a medal, but he kept us all alive. He'd give up his rum ration to men who were cracking up, volunteer to carry wounded men to safety, share his blanket with anyone who was shivering. That's real courage. The bonds formed between soldiers under these extreme conditions were unlike any relationships that existed in civilian life. Men who had shared the worst experiences imaginable developed a level of trust and intimacy that would last for decades after the war ended. These relationships were based on absolute mutual dependence. Your survival literally depended on the men around you, and their survival depended on you. This created loyalties that transcended family relationships, romantic attachments, and all other civilian connections. The intensity of these bonds would make it difficult for veterans to form normal peacetime relationships. How do you explain to a wife or civilian friend that your closest emotional connections were forged in hell, that the men who truly understood you were those who had seen you at your absolute worst? Private Samuel Clark reflected on these unique relationships. Henderson and I have seen each other covered in our own filth, crying like babies, doing things we never thought we'd be capable of. We've held each other while shells were falling, shared our last piece of food, slept in the same muddy hole for warmth. No civilian relationship could ever be that deep. The religious and philosophical implications of trench warfare were profound and lasting. Men were forced to confront questions about the nature of existence, the meaning of suffering, and the possibility of divine justice under conditions that challenged every traditional answer. Some soldiers lost their faith entirely, unable to reconcile their experiences with any concept of a benevolent deity. Others developed a darker, more complex spirituality that incorporated the reality of random suffering and meaningless death. Chaplain Father Patrick Kelly struggled to provide spiritual guidance under these conditions. How do you preach about God's love when you're standing in a graveyard that stretches for hundreds of miles? How do you talk about divine justice when good men die horrible deaths and evil men survive unharmed? The theology I learned in seminary has no answers for these questions. The men who survived the trenches would carry these philosophical questions with them for the rest of their lives. They had experienced conditions that challenged every assumption about human existence, divine purpose, and the meaning of life itself. The transformation was complete and irreversible. These men had been changed at the most fundamental level by their experiences. They would never again be able to live as if they didn't know what human beings were capable of enduring, what civilization could become when stripped of its comfortable illusions. Yet somehow, many would find ways to build meaningful lives after the war ended. They would marry, raise families, contribute to their communities, and create beauty in a world they had seen at its most ugly. Their resilience was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of their entire experience. The rat-infested trenches of the First World War had tested the absolute limits of human endurance. The men who survived had proven that people could adapt to any conditions, endure any hardship, overcome any obstacle if they had sufficient motivation and support from their comrades. But this survival came at a cost that would be paid over lifetimes. They had learned secrets about human nature that civilian society wasn't prepared to hear. They had seen behind the comfortable assumptions that allowed normal life to function. Their knowledge would make them valuable witnesses to human resilience, but also permanent strangers in their own societies. They had been marked by experiences that pushed human endurance beyond all reasonable limits, and those marks would never fully fade. The legacy of these transformations would extend far beyond individual soldiers. Entire communities would struggle to reintegrate men who had been fundamentally altered by their experiences. Wives would find themselves married to strangers who bore only superficial resemblance to the men who had left for war. Children would grow up with fathers who could never fully explain where they had been or what they had seen. The economic implications were equally staggering. Men who had learned to live on perhaps 800 calories a day, who had made tools from battlefield debris, who had survived on ingenuity and improvisation, found themselves unable to participate in a consumer economy based on artificial scarcity and manufactured desire. Private Arthur Pemberton struggled with economic displacement. Went to the shops yesterday with my wife. She wanted to buy 3 different types of soap, each for a different purpose. I stood there thinking about the time I traded my tobacco ration for 1 small bar of lye soap, and felt like the richest man alive. How do you explain to someone that they already have everything they could possibly need? The concept of necessity had been permanently redefined for these men. They had learned to distinguish between genuine needs and manufactured wants with a clarity that made civilian commerce seem like elaborate theatre. Marketing appeals that relied on creating artificial dissatisfaction fell flat on men who had experienced genuine scarcity. The work ethic that developed in the trenches was unlike anything found in peacetime employment. Men who had learned that laziness or inattention could mean death for themselves and their comrades brought an intensity to civilian jobs that often overwhelmed their employers and co-workers. But this same intensity could be problematic. Men who had learned to work through pain, exhaustion, and illness would push themselves beyond reasonable limits, unable to recognize when rest and recovery were necessary rather than signs of weakness. Sergeant Major Patrick O'Brien discovered this during his first civilian job. Worked 16 hours straight on my first day at the factory. Foreman had to order me to go home. Couldn't understand why everyone else seemed so concerned about an 8-hour work day. After the trenches, any job where people aren't shooting at you seems like vacation. The sleep disorders that developed in the trenches proved to be among the most persistent and problematic long-term effects. Men who had learned to sleep while standing, who had adapted to constant noise and danger, found peacetime quiet almost unbearable. The silence of civilian bedrooms became a source of anxiety rather than comfort. Without the familiar sounds of artillery, rifle fire, and human activity, many veterans felt vulnerable and exposed. They would create artificial noise to help them sleep, or would choose to sleep outdoors where they felt more secure. Private Daniel Murphy's wife documented his sleep difficulties. He hasn't slept in a bed since he came home 6 months ago. Every night he takes his blanket outside and sleeps on the ground. Says the mattress feels too soft, makes him feel like he's sinking. The quiet keeps him awake, so he sleeps near the road where there's traffic noise. The hypervigilance that had kept men alive in the trenches became a liability in civilian life. Veterans would unconsciously scan every room for exits, position themselves where they could see all approaches, and react with excessive alarm to unexpected movements or sounds. This constant state of alert readiness was exhausting and made normal social interaction difficult. Men would attend family gatherings or social events, but remain psychologically separate, monitoring for threats that didn't exist, preparing for dangers that would never materialize. The dietary adaptations that had allowed survival on inadequate rations created their own set of post-war problems. Men's digestive systems had adapted to process minimal nutrition efficiently, making them unable to tolerate normal quantities of food without becoming violently ill. Dr. Catherine Mills documented these digestive issues. They return from the front with stomachs that have shrunk to perhaps half normal size. Feeding them regular portions makes them sick. Their bodies have adapted so completely to starvation conditions that normal nutrition becomes a medical challenge. The psychological relationship with food remained permanently altered. Men who had gone days without eating, who had shared scraps with rats, who had eaten things that would have been unthinkable before the war, could never again take meals for granted. Family dinners became exercises in guilt and confusion. How do you enjoy abundance when you know that men are still dying from hunger? How do you complain about the quality of food when you remember being grateful for mouldy bread? Corporal James Mitchell struggled with these contradictions. My mother prepared my favourite meal for my homecoming, roast beef with all the trimmings. Sat there looking at more food than I'd seen in months, and all I could think about was Henderson sharing his last piece of hardtack with me the day before he died. Couldn't take a bite without feeling like I was betraying everyone still over there. The alcohol dependency that had developed as a survival mechanism in the trenches became a serious social problem in peacetime. Men who had learned to function while heavily intoxicated found themselves unable to cope with civilian stress without chemical assistance. The quality and availability of civilian alcohol was different from military rations, leading to unpredictable effects. Men would drink to achieve the numbing effect they remembered from the trenches, only to discover that civilian spirits affected them differently. The social drinking customs that had existed before the war seemed meaningless to men who had used alcohol as medicine. They drank for effect, not for pleasure, leading to conflicts with family members and employers who didn't understand the medicinal nature of their consumption. Private Thomas Henderson's struggle with alcohol typified the experience of many veterans. People think I'm drinking for fun, but I'm drinking to function. Without it, my hands shake so badly I can't hold a cup. The nightmares come back, the sounds, the smells. The alcohol isn't recreation, it's medication. The industrial skills that men had developed while maintaining equipment under impossible conditions proved valuable in the post-war economy, but they came with psychological costs. Veterans could repair anything, improvise solutions to complex problems, and work effectively under extreme pressure. However, these same men often struggled with the social aspects of civilian employment. They had learned to communicate primarily through military orders or desperate whispers during bombardments. The subtle negotiations and office politics of peacetime work were incomprehensible to men who had dealt with life and death decisions daily. The bonds formed with fellow veterans became more important than family relationships in many cases. Men would travel great distances to attend reunions, not out of nostalgia, but out of desperate need to be with people who understood their experiences. These veteran gatherings served a crucial psychological function. For a few hours or days, men could be themselves without explanation or apology. They could reference shared experiences without having to provide context or justify their reactions. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb organized many such reunions. When the lads get together, you can see them relax in ways their families never witness. They don't have to pretend to be normal, don't have to hide their reactions to loud noises, or explain why they can't sleep indoors. For those few hours, they're home. The parenting styles of veterans were profoundly influenced by their trench experiences. Men who had seen how quickly life could end became either overprotective of their children or emotionally distant, unable to form attachments that might result in devastating loss. Some veterans taught their children survival skills that seemed excessive for civilian life, showing them how to find food in unlikely places, how to construct shelter from minimal materials, how to remain hidden and quiet when danger threatened. Others found themselves unable to connect emotionally with their children, afraid that loving them too deeply would make their eventual loss unbearable. The randomness of death that they had witnessed made every attachment seem fragile and temporary. These men had proven something that the world wasn't ready to understand. They had shown that human beings could survive absolutely anything, could adapt to conditions that should have destroyed them completely, could maintain their humanity even in the most inhuman circumstances imaginable. But their survival came at a price that would echo through generations. The rat-infested trenches of the First World War didn't just test the limits of human endurance.